Okay, so yeah, I'll be talking about hydrology for stream crossings this morning. And here's just an outline for where we're going for the talk this morning. Start with some just hydrology basics, going over a little bit some of what you heard about yesterday from folks like Matt LaCroix and others. And then we'll get into kind of the meat of the talk is going to be this discharge predictions for design, going through a number of different methods that are useful for coming up with flood frequency estimates in Alaska. And if you can stay awake through that, then we'll just have a few extra topics at the end there that go over some hydrology related to low flow, floodplains, and flood resiliency. So to start with, I think yesterday Matt had a nice phrase where he talked about that rivers and their flow regimes are integrators of the processes and landscape they're located in. So I think that's a nice thing to keep in mind, that the flow regime of a river is integrating a whole bunch of different factors to show up the way it does on a hydrograph. And this slide shows you three different hydrographs. And a hydrograph is just a plot, XY plot of time on the x-axis, and discharge on the y-axis. And discharge is a measure of how much water is in a river, measured in cubic feet per second. So that's on the y-axis. So we'll point out this first hydrograph on the upper left, just to make the point that in the month of August, for example, this system, if it's groundwater fed, really had really little variability throughout the month, whereas a precipitation driven watershed was seeing quite a bit of variability responding to precipitation events throughout that month. And then if you move over to the hydrograph on the upper right, it's showing a great example of a snowmelt system in pink, where the stream ramps up from its winter base flows to the spring melt event, where it kind of peaks early June with all that snow coming off maybe some mountainous headwaters, and then slowly decreases throughout the summer until it's just kind of get to background precipitation events and fall storms driving the hydrograph. And compare that to the glacier fed system in the dark blue line, then you're seeing think of the Kenai River or the Mendenhall and Juneau. It's ramping up throughout the early summer as the glacier starts melting, and then by the fall time, when that glacier turns off due to colder temperatures, then it starts dropping down again, but still can have some precipitation signals in there. And I think the key thing to think about is that's what's happening in the summertime. In the wintertime, when the landscape is frozen and there's no inputs, that river's back down to a pretty low volume and base flow conditions. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk when we talk about low flow hydrology and making sure fish can make it through during those events. And contrast that kind of wintertime base flow and summer variation with the hydrograph on the bottom, where it's a groundwater driven system. And this x-axis is showing the entire year from January to December. And you're just seeing not very much variability. It's just bouncing between 12 CFS and 20 throughout the whole year. So really stable. And I think the takeaway for this is just, you gotta think about the watershed you're working in for your stream crossing design, and try to think about what flows might be coming off that landscape to help you better understand the crossing you're designing. Okay, and in addition to just understanding how the hydrograph functions in your system, there's a whole bunch of other processes, biological processes responding to that hydrograph as well. And this is just an example of out-migrating pink salmon fry responding to the spring breakup event. And that's when they're timing their out-migration. I think the outmigrating fry and smolt have quite a bit of trouble with avian predators on that journey. So they're keyed into that breakup event when the water volume is larger, give them a little bit more room to hide, some more turbidity to avoid some of those predators. So yeah, that's one thing to think about for high flows. Also for adult coho coming back to spawn, they're keying into precipitation, storms, rain events to get into narrow, small parts of the watersheds. When it rains, that's when they're making their moves. So thinking about having connectivity through your crossings at some of these larger events is important. That's when fish move, but also we'll come back to those low flow events being important as well later in the talk. All right, so that's some of the background on hydrology. And now I just want to move into the second part of the talk. So phase 2, where we're talking about discharge prediction. And for our discharge, for our designs, we're designing to a 100-year flood event under the geomorphic analog design method, where we're working to make a culvert function as close to a natural channel as possible based on design reference reach. So the 100-year event provides enough capacity to have a pretty safe infrastructure in terms of being safe during flood events, but also large enough that you can have sediment inside that can be stable and all that. So that's what we're designing to for the geomorphic analog design method. And the methods I'll talk about on the next few slides are getting at how we can predict those events or predict the magnitude of those events for design. But first, just to go over a little bit of nomenclature so we're all clear and I don't throw too much jargon at you right away. But yeah, discharge I mentioned earlier is the measure of flow in a river, the volume per time in cubic feet per second. And its symbol in equations and in practice is the letter Q. So sometimes you'll hear folks say the Q100 or the Q2. So that's what they're talking about, the 2-year discharge or the 100-year discharge. And then reoccurrence interval is something that we'll talk about quite a bit. And one way to think about it is the average number of years between floods of a certain size. And it's just a way to try to describe these random events, try to describe the probability of these random flood events. And you'll see it like this. I think this is easiest, the recurrence interval, I think is easiest for most folks to understand, because as the number gets larger, so do the flood events or the flows. So a 100-year event is larger event and rarer, whereas a 2-year event is more run of the mill. And in other terms, you can think about it as a 100-year event being a 1 in 100 chance of occurring in any given year, or oftentimes you also see it as a percentage. So that 100-year event has a 1% chance of occurring in a given year. That's not to say 2 100-year events could happen back to back, but these are just the way we're working to describe the frequency of these events and their magnitude. Okay, so moving on, just before we get into the actual methods, just some tips, and I'll reiterate these later on about flood flow estimates for your designs. And I think that one of the key things we hit on that first slide where I showed all those hydrographs is just trying to understand the local hydrology and understand what are those processes and what are the characteristics of the watershed that flow regime, that river is integrating to come up with what the hydrograph looks like. And the next tip is just to make sure you use multiple methods to predict your flood discharges. And we'll talk some more about Alaska having some scarcity of hydrologic data and really needing to verify your estimates with multiple methods to come to a conclusion. That's a big theme in this talk. And then if you're able to, develop local prediction techniques and relationships, trying to understand if there's a gauge that really works well for a certain area, and can tell you which methods you might have more confidence in based on kind of what you're seeing in that particular area. I think that's something you really got to think about and develop over time. And if you're able to, say your project is several years out, collecting some hydrologic data prior to design work is another great opportunity you can do. You got some time on your hands before the project occurs. And then finally, if possible, try to verify what you're calculating with some actual field data. So some surveying in the field based on cross sections, things like that. We'll talk about that as one of the methods later on, but also just talking to local residents, old timers, maintenance department staff are great resources to try to understand things like how often has that maintenance crew dragged that culvert out of the woods, that 4-foot culvert out of the woods, and put it back in the road prism in the past 10 years. And you can try to work out what the capacity of that existing culvert is and get a sense for how often that thing's washing out and what flows. So just trying to use any and all information you can to get a better sense for what flows are at your crossing. Okay, so now into the different methods for coming up with flood frequency estimates. There are 7 in total that I'll be talking about today. And I've got them ranked in terms of probably the most reliable, or at least ones I would look at being a little bit better than others, down to ones I reach for later on. So the first 3 are all related to actually having some gauge data that you're working from. And then the ones a little bit later in the talk, the 4th one, you're actually using your survey data in the field to back calculate a discharge for bankful. And then some other methods, the regional regression equations, and then a couple that are more kind of precipitation based methods. Okay, so for starters, if you happen to be lucky enough to have a stream gauge that's been running at your crossing site, congratulations. That really doesn't happen too often, given the kind of scarcity of gauge data we have in Alaska compared to other parts of the US. But when that might occur, to work up the flood frequency estimates for a gauge, you'd use something called a Log-Pearson 3 analysis. And that's basically taking the peak flow events that occur in any given year and grabbing all those different peak flows from whatever period of record is available for that gauge and getting them into a table, and then running that analysis that will predict out based on what's been observed in the past, what a 2-year event is on average and what a 100-year event or a 500-year event might be. And a great resource for Alaska has been the USGS publication by Curran et al. So there's been a couple more recently, 2003 and in 2016. And the tables in those publications already do all the Log-Pearson 3 analysis for you. So you can use those as a resource if you happen to be working from a gauge nearby your stream crossing design. Other resources for gauge data, there's the USGS water data for Alaska page. That'll give you any current running stream gauge data. And then the other thing I look at pretty much straight away whenever I start doing design work for a crossing is the USGS data mapper. And that you can toggle on both active and inactive sites and see which ones have peak flow data that you could work with in the vicinity of your crossing. And that'll be, I think, something I do almost first in my process for doing some hydrology design work. And then you can click on those little icons. You can get to their gauge page to get the data and work up whatever you need to. So here's just a map showing gauges throughout Alaska. I think that maybe the takeaway here is just seeing some of the parts of Alaska, western, northern Alaska, where they're just a huge swaths of the state where we don't have much, really low density of stream gauges, and that just goes into having a little poor understanding of what flows are in the state compared to other parts of the U.S. So the table here on the top is just showing all the great information you can find in those USGS publications, and the Log-Pearson 3 analysis you can just pull right out of those. But if you're unlucky and you've got a stream gauge maybe that didn't end up into those publications, or you've got some of your own data, there's spreadsheets out there that you can use, and US Forest Service has one where you can input your data and get a Log-Pearson 3 relationship showed for your data that you have available. So there's a link to that below. One point that's pretty important to make on stream gauges in their period of record is that not only is Alaska, we've got a kind of a limited number of stream gauges, but we also have ones that maybe don't have as long a record as elsewhere. And this chart, this chart is just showing you, if you were to do that Log-Pearson 3 analysis of gauge peak flow records over different periods of time within a particular stream gauge's record, you could get some really different results for what a 100-year flood might be. So that's just kind of like a word of caution, and just be aware that if you've got a stream gauge with a pretty short period of record, you just know a little bit less about what flows are in that system. It's kind of like, maybe an analogy could be, if you've only seen so many cards in the deck in one of these, if you only have a few years of data, and you have less ability to guess what might be coming up in the future. Whereas if you have a longer period of record, you've seen quite a few more cards in that deck and have a better prediction overall. All right, so that was for if you've got just working up a gauge at your crossing site. But if you have a crossing that you're designing within the watershed of a gauge, but not necessarily at the gauge itself, there is a nice method you could try that is documented in those USGS publications, where you actually extrapolate the gauge data to your ungauged location with using both the gauge record and the gauge prediction of flood events and the regional regression equations. And I'm going to mention some caveats here that is going to come up again and again, that all relates back to knowing your local hydrology. Is that the reliability of this estimate really is a function of how similar the watershed area that you're looking at is to that overall gauge area. So it really needs to assume similar hydrology, and so that means similar factors getting assimilated into that flow regime. So topography, geology, vegetation, precipitation, all those things need to be similar to have a good confidence in using relating these two areas of a watershed. And a rule of thumb, general for using these equations from USGS for relating those two with the regression equation for your site and the overall gauge record, is using a 0.5 to 1.5 times the gauge site's watershed area. And this is what those equations look like for combining both the regression equation for your ungauged part of your watershed and the gauge part of the watershed. And I'll talk some more about the regression equation a little bit later on, but I think I'll just move on from here. I don't have to get too technical this morning on equations. All right. So saying you don't have a gauge really, or a gauge in the watershed that you're working on doing a crossing for. You can also just use a discharge per watershed area approach, where you take a gauge of with similar hydrologic setting and work up how much discharge comes out of that watershed, depending on your flood interval per square mile, basically, and then just relate that to the watershed area of your crossing. So I'll work through an example here, but caveat there. Remember, it still relates to how similar those watersheds are. But one example I have is 6 Mile outlet on J-Bear in Anchorage. So this is located on the military base in Anchorage, and it's this groundwater fed system, and doesn't have any like high relief the way a lot of the gauge streams in Anchorage have. So the gauge streams in Anchorage are like Ship Creek and Chester Creek and Campbell Creek, and they all have these headwaters up in the Chugach front range. So they're really different topography wise, and so they're not really good ones to compare to this smaller watershed that's really in the lowlands of Anchorage. And I definitely tried other methods, but one thing I tried to try to better understand here what flows might be like in 6 Mile was to look at other stream gauges that were active with peak flow data that had some similar hydrology, like Caswell Creek, pretty far away, but it at least had really similar lowland groundwater fed series of lakes, similar to 6 Mile. And to work up this method, you'd grab the gauge estimate from that USGS publication from the Log-Pearson 3 analysis. So that's what, based on the 25 years of peak flow data for Caswell Creek, 100-year flood is coming out to a 580 cubic feet per second. And then you would divide the discharge in each of those intervals by the area to come up with how much cubic feet per second come out per square mile, and then just multiply that by your watershed area of concern to come up with an estimate there. And just caveat here, this is only one of multiple methods I looked at to try to come up with a design flow. So, but this is a useful tool. All right, so those were the methods related to gauge data. And this fourth method is derived from all that physical survey data you collect on site. You'll probably be hearing more about that later today for sure. And so those are things like your cross section and your long profile. And you can take what you collect, like the bankful area and the hydraulic radius and the slope, and an estimate for Mannings N from your grain size to back out what a bankful discharge might be. And this can be a really good check on some other flow estimation methods to see what the physical channel that you measured is telling you about something between a Q1.5 and a Q2. And Matt Varner talked to you yesterday about what bankful channels look like and indicators and all that. And I think he mentioned that 0.5 to 2 as a kind of average, what that correlates to. And he also talked about regional curves. And a thing to do could be to compare your bankful cross section to other channels, other systems, and maybe ultimately come up with a regional curve that connects discharge to watershed area the same way those regional curves are connecting cross-sectional area to the watershed area. So that's maybe a little bit down the road for Alaska. While we're talking about the bankful cross-section, one thing I just want to bring up is the ordinary high water mark comes up quite a bit. We'll hear some more about it later today from Jess and Emily, I'm sure, when they do their talk. But it's by definition, it's in the Alaska it's got a definition by Alaska statute for a mark along a bank. And it's really used to help demarcate between where the land stops and water stops in terms for property, or where the water starts in terms of property boundaries. And it's, I think, a key thing in the definition here, when you're trying to understand the two, bankful discharge and ordinary high water mark, is that this is something that occurs almost in every year, or literally every year, so that it's a line where vegetation doesn't grow because it's always inundated up to that point every year. So with that phrasing in the definition, you can think that this is an ordinary high water mark. If you associate a discharge with that, it would be something, at least a Q1, or something that happens every year, or even more often than every year throughout the year. And the takeaway there is just a discharge associated with ordinary high water mark would be less than a bankful discharge, which we just talked about being between 1.5 and a 2-year event. And just wanted to caution on confusing the two. You'll hear some more about ordinary high water mark later today, I'm sure. All right, so that was using your physical data on site and the Mannings equation. Now we're moving on to those USGS regional regression equations. And there has been, a series of iterations of these, the most recent ones from 2003 and 2016. And there's links to those on this page here. And I still look at both. Just, it's always good to have multiple methods to refer to inform your thinking about discharge in a watershed. And I'll talk through just like where these come from and how they originate a little bit, using the 2003 one as an example. For that development of that regression equation, the state was divided up into 7 hydrologic regions that were, kind of more similar in terms of climate or things like that. And then all the gauges located in each of those regions, the Log-Pearson type 3 distribution was worked up, and then a whole bunch of different characteristics of those watersheds were kind of thrown at those flows to come up with an equation that could predict flow based on those just watershed and climate characteristics. So that things like rainfall, watershed area, land cover, things like that. So a different equation was developed for each region. And another great thing about those publications is that they also do a great job showing you what the standard error is in each of your estimates. And as you can see, it can be pretty broad on that. So that's why this isn't one of the ones I go to first in terms of methods, but one of many. So this is getting a little bit more detail on the 2003 equation, those 7 different regions and the different variable inputs that are required for each of those. And it varies depending on which region you're working in. And I just want to point out along the bottom in yellow, I have included the minimum drainage area and the maximum drainage area. And that's just coming from what the gauge area sizes were that went into developing each of these equations. And I just want to caution, if you work on designing a crossing in a watershed that is smaller or larger than this range, and then you're kind of just going off the edge of the map, in a way for what went into building those regression equations. So that's just a word of caution. So you have take whatever results you get from those with a bigger grain of salt for sure. The same goes for the data input. You really need to use the input data that was used to generate the equations as your input data as well. So keeping all the same data source for your inputs. All right. So, and this is just showing you graphically what that standard error looks like on a prediction for using the 2003 equation. So as you go into larger flood events, those standard errors get a little wider. Those bars get a little wider for you. So just things to keep in mind when you're using these equations. All right, so moving on to the 2016 regression equation. It was an update and it got rid of those different hydrological regions and opted with just a single equation for the whole state. It has a little bit, they want that direction to have a little bit better statistical power, larger n value to work with. And the input variables are just drainage area and mean annual precipitation, which I think we'll talk about, on the next slide here. The watershed area is pretty straightforward. You would just map that by hand or using GIS to come up with the square miles area of your watershed. And then the prism precipitation data, that's some data that got worked up by a group at Oregon State, and it's a 30-year average annual precipitation for the whole state of Alaska. And it comes as a raster data set. So a whole bunch of little cells for the whole state. And you can use GIS to get the average precipitation pulled out of those by averaging up all those cells for your watershed area. And a little bit more on the prism data comes in the 771 meter cell sizes. Units are millimeters times 100. And an important note from chatting with DOT a few years back, they were finding that some of the smaller watersheds on the Richardson Highway had some trouble using those larger cell size at 771 meter cell size, because if a cell was not entirely within the bounds of your watershed delineation, it wasn't getting included in the average. So they did a clever thing and just resampled the raster to a little bit smaller size, kept all the same geometry overall, but just move the decimal place over and resampled the raster to get more cells within that average watershed precipitate. Get a better average for the precipitation in that watershed. So if you're not GIS savvy, or you just want to take a look at what flows might be in a watershed of interest in parts of the state that have had updated hydrography, there is the USGS stream stats tool for around Cook Inlet. And with that, you can just click on a map and it can delineate your watershed and spit out the 2016 regression equation results. So something to look at if you're working in those areas. It could be a useful tool for you. All right, so I think one last slide on the regression equations. Just want to reiterate some of the limitations and some tips. They should not be your exclusive method applied. You should really try to use some other methods as well. And when you're coming up with the inputs for those regression equations, make sure you use the same methods that the publications did to have good confidence in those estimates and to have the standard error and all that uncertainty still be valid. Otherwise, you're going a little bit off what was used to build it. And then just beware of extrapolating those flood estimates beyond the input data used. So if you're working on a really small watershed and it's outside of, and it's smaller than any of the gauges that were used to build those regression equations, be aware that your estimates might be way off. And generally the USGS gauges are on slightly larger watersheds, so they may not be very representative of the stream you're looking at. And just to remember, as you get to smaller watersheds, peak flow per unit area increases, and that's just a function of the watershed being smaller and less distance to get to the stream and all that, and where other factors like storage are less and just generally could be a little bit flashier. All right, so that's all we got to say about the regression equations for now. And now just moving on to the last two methods. We're almost there. Hang in there. The NRCS has a method that is based on drainage area, rainfall, and land cover and storage. And generally, I'll look to these if I'm working in a smaller watershed like that 4 square mile, 6 mile, 6 mile watershed in J-Bear. I looked at this method too, just to, or if I'm really stumped, I'll just look at all the methods that are out there to get a better sense for what the peak flows might be in a given watershed. And some challenges of using this one is sometimes the land cover data for Alaska is not as good as elsewhere. So this is another level of not having great certainty on this one. So a couple links down below. NRCS actually has like a software program you can use. There's also spreadsheets out there that you can use to work up this method, and the link to the publications below too. And then the last method is the rational method, and it's similar. It's uses the rainfall intensity as kind of the main precipitation signal for this method, the drainage area, and dimensionless runoff coefficient. That's something you'd look at from a table usually. And this method, I think, gets quite a bit of use. And the dimensionless runoff coefficient kind of relates to like the land cover, that kind of thing. And this one, I think, gets quite a bit of use, especially on smaller watersheds and even like parking lot design, drainage design, things like that. But it could still be useful if you're looking at a smaller watershed. Okay, so we're getting to summing up the different methods we just talked about. And this is just a chart showing the output of an analysis I did for a tributary to Caswell Creek off the Parks Highway up north of Willow. And it is showing the two different the ungaged stream regression equations of 2016 and the 2003. And at the Q100, at the 100-year event, the 2003 and this Gage watershed ratio method were actually looking pretty good. And in this case, I had quite a bit of confidence in the Gage watershed ratio. There is a 25-year record of peak flows on Caswell Creek. So using the data, using the Gage data that's available is always a great thing, because it's hard to beat Gage data in the watershed. So, and this one, I think we used Gage watershed ratio as the preferred method for the Q100 estimate. But that's just showing you kind of the spread of what you might see in your design, in your hydrology design phase. So a lot to sift through, and the more methods, the better, and the better understanding of local hydrology, the better too. All right, so summing all this up, always use different estimation methods to check your flows. I think that last slide kind of showed you'll probably have a spread, and it'll take some careful thought, interpretation to go with to determine your design flow. Which is correct? None. Which one to use? All of them. And if possible, try to use a conservative approach. You could use the largest flow, or add 1 or 2 standard errors, or just always try to have, if you're going to go with a smaller flow, try to understand why a certain estimated method was showing too high, rather than what you're thinking is the correct one. Conservative approach, but also keep in mind, like if you go too large, you're also potentially wasting resources that could be used on a different crossing. So trying to come up with a good medium that also has you feeling okay with the result. It takes some work and iteration for sure. And yeah, finally, just develop local prediction techniques, get to know those local watersheds, what's driving them, and collect local flow data if you can, for sure. Okay, so that was all the hydrology estimation methods. And I have a slide here I'm going to just skip. If you want to get geeked out on relative uncertainty and calculating it for your methods, this is just a slide on that. But we'll just skip that for now. I think we've had enough equations for this morning. All right, so if you've fallen asleep or like are scrolling through your email, come back now. We're going to have some more pretty pictures and less equations. So this next part, we're on to part 3 of the talk, where we'll just hit a few topics, including low flow, floodplain hydrology, and flood resiliency. So this first part of that was just talking about low flow discharge. And Heather will definitely talk some more about low flow channel design later on. And I'm just going to hit some points about hydrology related to low flow channels. I think some of the best options you have is collect some flow measurements while you're out there for designing, while you're out there visiting your site for design work or doing your field surveys. You'll probably be out there 2 or 3 times before you take all that data and sit on it for the winter and work on your designs. So if you can collect some measurements while you're out there, it can give you a better sense for what flows you've seen and kind of calibrate your eye for what's normal in that system at base flow times. Especially do that if you've had rain for a month. It could be a great time to see what base flows look like on your system and help you design that low flow channel and low flow connectivity. All right, if not, definitely look at low flow conditions at nearby gauges, and always try to mimic the reference reach channel cross section if none of those are available. But yeah, going back to that original slide, just think about the local hydrology, how the hydrograph might be behaving, and what kind of system you're working with, and what's feeding the stream in terms of water. And to drive that home, just here's a slide that's showing 2 different hydrographs, Cottonwood Creek and Wasilla, and the flow really doesn't change, 10 to 20 CFS. And that one, you could use your reference reach, and you'll probably stay wetted the entire year round, and you don't have too much to worry about. It barely changes. Whereas on the Indian River and Sitka, I think this is one that Sean Egan might have referred to yesterday when he was talking about that 2015 and 2016 low water, high temperature event. And it's mountain precipitation fed system where it has a lot of variability throughout the year as precipitation events occur. And even though a designer, you might get really concerned about some of the monster flows that come down the Indian River, and design for those, and make sure you've got a good, safe, stable channel that can handle those big flows. But if you design like the perfect trapezoidal channel to pass those massive flows and forget about how low the flows get down here around 20 CFS in the summertime, you could probably fail. Your design will probably fail for in terms of fish passage as well. If you have a whole bunch of pink salmon stacked up below your channel at 20 CFS, and you're getting calls about stinky salmon and things like that. So definitely don't forget about low flow channels in those terms, and also a little bit about why. And this will reiterate some of what Sean talked about yesterday as well. He mentioned the 2019 event in South Central in the summertime. This is a chart of Croto Creek. It's a tributary to Deshka, and it's been gauged since 2017. And by 2019, the summer low flow event occurred. It didn't rain pretty much all summer, and it definitely got pretty sunny. So if you zoom in on those summer months, the black line is your discharge, and the blue dotted line that goes across is the 40 CFS, which I think was about the lowest base flow we'd seen prior to that summer. So it dropped really low. And the temperature with those sunny days spiked as well. The blue line is showing that. And I got the red line there that's showing a threshold for the maximum temperature for juvenile salmon rearing. That's at 18 degrees Celsius, according to an EPA publication. But as Sean mentioned yesterday, those are kind of like, can be different for every stream and different for fish and at different life stages and or different settings. So in any case, fish are feeling it that summer and definitely needing to move around, get out of warmer areas and find cold water refugia to avoid just big mortality events, and ensuring that your crossings can handle some of those lower flows is important for those extreme events. And I guess that's one thing to note is some publications by Sue Mager et al. Predicted some of these types of events, but not really occurring until 20 or 30 years from now based on climate change. But this is an extreme event we were seeing way before I think folks were really expecting it. So that's that piece on the summertime low flows. On the wintertime, I think on that first slide where I showed the hydrograph and the glacier fed and the snowmelt fed systems dropping to really low base flows compared to their summertime flows. In the wintertime, flows in the rivers can drop pretty low, especially in south, like northern part of Alaska, maybe not so much in southeast. But at those points, anchor ice and frazzle ice, different icing events can cause some severe mortality to juvenile salmon. And fish need to be able to move around to avoid those hazardous ice conditions. And one study from on cutthroat trout found that they were moving around over 6 times a winter. So they're not just parked if they're sometimes in these stream channels for the winter. They're moving around, avoiding these ice, trying to survive. So making sure that low flow is possible, low flow connectivity is possible in the wintertime is important for that reason as well. All right, so moving on to floodplain hydrology. I'm just going to kind of go through an example of a channel here. This is a LiDAR view of a channel in the Mat-Su. And if you can imagine when a flood event occurs and it gets larger than that bank full discharge and spills out across its channel, across its floodplain, there's lower velocity flows out of that channel moving along. And if you were to construct a crossing there that only passes flow through that main channel, you'll end up with all kinds of kind of negative effects on floodplain connectivity, things that were touched on yesterday. So you could have sediment deposition upstream of the culvert as that backwaters, and then a bit of a hydraulic drop as it enters that culvert because there's just so much flow that's coming off the floodplain has to make it through your culvert. And a good idea is just to account for that, have some floodplain relief culverts, or maybe just site, in this case, it looks like a pretty dynamic system. You would just site a bridge that spans that whole thing in a narrow spot, something like that. And drill down into floodplain connectivity a little bit, floodplain hydrology a little bit more is an interesting example from the Kenai by a master's degree student studying the peat wetland channel system, where the photo on the top right, on the right, flow is going from right to left here. There's a kind of undisturbed peatland. There's a ditch that you can kind of see running there with the different grasses grown in it, and then the road itself. And they wired up this thing with all kinds of barometers and stream temperature loggers, and were able to see that this peatland, that's shallow groundwater that Sean was talking a little bit about yesterday, ended up getting captured by the ditch of the road. And then when it entered that ditch, it warmed up in the sunshine and all that. So it went from groundwater to surface water, and then traversed through those culverts, ended up back in the stream channel at a flow at temperatures that were not as ideal for juvenile salmon. So it's just another effect of maybe not having adequate floodplain hydrology thought about to kind of maintain the existing conditions at this site. And following up on that, you could have the extreme event like Montana Creek here on Yoder Road in the Mat-Su, where the 2012 event resulted in the channel avulsing and using that floodplain to cross the road, where the flow was the flow conveyance through that culvert itself, or the bridge itself, was not sufficient for that event. And so that's kind of one extreme where you have a really dynamic system moving across a floodplain, using that floodplain. And you could also have like the much less dramatic, like a photo on the bottom right where Kirsty showed yesterday, just vegetation changes on either side of crossing due to the infrastructure that was placed there. And I think that might be, a good thing to think about, that the crossings that you're designing could have, subtle changes, maybe a little bit of temperature change here, some vegetation change over time, maybe some sediment building up in different ways upstream and downstream. But overall, it's over time. It's changing the channel, it's the stream and the floodplain function from its natural condition, from what those fish and aquatic life were adapted to over time to a new one that may not be as ideal for them. Okay, and then, all right, so last few slides on flood resiliency. I just want to mention climate change and some of your options for thinking about climate change and hydrology flood flow predictions. The UAF maintains these SNAP projected downscale projections for precipitation in Alaska going in the future. There's a lot of different raster data sets you can look at there using different climate models and different predictions for human CO2 release. And I think a good thing to look at is this recent publication that Department of Transportation and SNAP worked on. And I think that might be a great place to start if you're trying to consider climate change and what models might be the best ones to look at for thinking about that in the future. I guess all the caveats here is we talked a lot about uncertainty of the existing methods we have, and climate change will just throw, and trying to incorporate climate change will be adding some more uncertainty as well in those predictions for future precipitation. But generally, warmer and wetter is a story for Alaska. And also this publication, Precipitation Projections for Alaska, there's a nice web tool that you can click on a map and see future rainfall for predictions. So definitely check that out if you're curious. And one last slide here is just talking about sea level change. I think the science on that is getting better all the time. We're learning new things about what climate change and sea level might happen in the future. Overall, a lot of Alaska is just still responding to isostatic rebound from the last ice age. So this is the 30-year average millimeters per year change for a lot of Alaska, and a lot of it is still actually rising above, exceeding the rate of sea level rise. So it can just something to think about two ways. If you're expecting your culvert to be backwatered by the high tides, it may not be in Skagway or some of these other places. Give it a few years. And on the flip side, there's a few areas in Alaska that might be experiencing sea level rise. And you need to think about that for your high flood flow capacity design. If you end up having a high tide event and a big flood event at the same time, could compromise your structure. All right, so those are all the topics I wanted to hit. I have a couple slides here just showing you citations, so if you need those, and some links, but I'm ready for questions at this point.